The deity that's associated with the path of Qoph is El, who is originally from the land of Canaan. And as looking at this energetic for this path, I also want to bring in the feminine aspect, El's wife, Asherah. So I have to kind of say a disclaimer here, because I do consider myself to be a scholar, even a religious scholar, but I am not a scholar on Canaanite religion. So this is all new information for me. It was a research project that I just tried to do my best on. And if anybody knows something that I don't, then they can elaborate in the comments, I guess. Here we have a picture of El and Asherah. Oh my God, I actually didn't do anything. There we go. Set up my transitions. This is the familiar Qoph attributes. We've already looked at the back of the head and the cerebellum, and we've looked at the tarot card for the moon. So this is just to refresh your memory. This is the letter here, Qoph, and the Hebrew divine name, El and Asherah. So if you will, please, go ground yourself in your feet and your breath. And be aware of the breath in your body. You don't need to go into too deep of a meditation, but I would like you to exhale and connect down into the center of the planet, or as deep as you can go. And just exhale and feel that energetic boost coming right back up to you and illuminating your head. Right? And the head is going to be Malkuth. So we did this visualization with the image of the tree not too long ago. Now we're doing it without the image, just from your recollection. And we invite in our holy guardian angel to receive this information and help us to make the associations so that we may become a worthy vessel of God. Directly above you is the illumination of Yesod. And you are the tree. You are the tree. Malkuth is your head. To your left, to your right is Hod, which is usually on our left, but we're going to put it on our right because we are the tree today. We are not looking at the tree. This is the path that we already explored. And on our left is Netzach, illuminated through the color of our slides. And you can see it. And we're on this path now. And with that, we will enter the land of Canaan. So here, this image on the left shows where Canaan is. You can see its relationship to Israel, the Sinai Desert, the Dead Sea, Jericho, Jerusalem, and Damascus, and of course the Mediterranean. It's a large chunk of territory that is referred to today as Levant. Modern-day Israel, Palestine, Palestinian territories, Lebanon, and the western parts of Jordan and Syria. The known history of these peoples go back to 3,500 BCE, before Common Era, making these deities 6,000 years old. when they were introduced by the Anunnaki. Prior to that, you would get into extraterrestrial mythology. So these were tent-dwelling, farming, and herding societies. And this map on the other side shows the people that were living in this area predominantly around the time of Genesis. I didn't get a whole lot of information on this image, but it's very interesting to me. I think what the colors probably represent are trading groups, families, and interrelated tribes would be my guess. I do notice that one of these tribes is referred to as Ashkenaz, which is what my heritage is. So it's a big chunk of people that moved around and probably fought over areas that we could see highlighted here. So there's a lot of interrelationship. It's easy to see how there could be intermingling. It's easy to see how there could be overlap. And there's some evidence that the Hebrew language originated in Canaanite and the peoples of Canaan. And I have an article on that. I think I'll just post the article. I was thinking about doing something more in depth around linguistics, but I think posting the article is easier because that can be really hard for me to look at linguistics. We find mention of El in writings that include Ugaritic, Phoenician, Syriac, Arabic, Akkadian, and Proto-Semitic. Lots of different people throughout lots of different times. It was used as a generic and a specific name. El is a seed syllable that represents the holy. I want to draw your attention to this word Moab, where the Moab desert is, and Sinai. This area right here is what we'll be looking at, the Negev desert. So this is what it looks like now. The fall of Canaan is described in the book of Joshua, in the first book of Judges. And if you remember, it was from the book of Judges that we met Deborah, the bee. But here we're referencing what happened after Exodus, which was estimated at 1280 BCE, where the children of Israel entered the promised land and they were ordered to destroy the Canaanites by their god, El, who may have been El in that iteration. There are still people today who trace their ancestry back to Canaan. You can find these people have communities on the internet where they hook up with, hey, I'm a Canaanite too. I could be a Canaanite for all I know. I probably am. The chief of the pantheon of the deities of the time of Canaan and the father of the gods that were worshipped by the Canaanites of Israel was called El. And he's portrayed here in several different ways. Over here we have a Bronze Age temple carving. And I'm not sure what the details are on this, but this is a very common format. It's very similar to this image in the middle, which is the most common image and representation of El that we see. This central image was excavated at Megiddo, Israel in 1400 BCE, which was 2,000 years after Canaan was established. So we could really think about this deity El as going back to the very beginnings of how we understand Western civilization. He was a persisting deity and archetype that we still see represented in today's culture and religious thought. Here we see him again. He's got in one hand he's holding a book, and in the other hand he's holding his hand up. And so this hand gesture is very similar. I'm going to make a cross-cultural reference. This is very similar to the Buddha, the Abhya Buddha, and the hand gesture means do not be afraid. And I thought that that was so interesting that I had to mention the correspondence. In the other images, you can see where his hands had fallen off because they were probably very thin and delicate. But by the time they made this statue, they made his arms nice and chunky and kept them. So he got to keep his hands. So there's a text called the Ras Shamra, which is an ancient Ugarit, where they discuss El. And it's indicated that in that text that his name means God, and he was portrayed as a fatherly figure, a kind and just judge, and the originator of everything. He was the creator of all created things. It was his responsibility to make sure that equilibrium was preserved among all that conflicting and competing powers within his domain. And if you remember the map and the way that it intertwined with one another and how close and densely packed these different groups were, you can see why that might have been necessary. It was said of El that his decree was wise and his wisdom was everlasting. He was known as the kindly and compassionate, and he was the head of a council of gods. But his task was to be the father, the God of fathers. He particularly represented patriarchy and fathers. And he was referred to as God the Father. He was also the god of the sky. Sometimes he was exemplified as a bull figure, and I know that because I read it in a lot of texts, but I did not see any examples of those bull figures, but I do see this. You know, notice this prominent sexual energy. And you can see that there are a number of different animals around him, and he's kind of towering over all of them. Uh-oh. So the Hebrew word for God is El, which is the root of the word Elohim. And we have already seen the Elohim. Where did we see them?
We saw the Elohim as Nisach, and then when we got to Hod, it was the mini Elohim, the sons of the gods.
Okay, and so here's El, the Father. We see the word El occurring in Masoretic texts 217 times, 73 times in Psalms, and 55 times in the book of Job. It is consisting of two letters, Aleph and Lamed, which I think I had represented in the slide previously. I'm a little off on my slides, I'm sorry. Let me take a peek. Okay, that's not it. Aleph and Lamed. So this is the same word that's used in Arabic as the word God, which is Allah, which is Aleph, Lamed, and Hey. In Hebrew, that would be pronounced Eloah. So it sounds like there's a relationship to each other there. Of course, there is. There are two letter alphabets. These two letters are fixed to a lot of names to give them a sign of divine origin. And the letter A, Aleph, is the symbol of an ox's head, which is a symbol of power and is ascribed to the number 1. So we see this actually in English still to this day, forming adjectives from nouns or other adjectives of, like, related to, pertaining, or having the character of, or a verb that indicates that somebody is doing something. It's directional. So it's all throughout our language, but we also see it with the archangels, Michael, Ariel, Raphael, and Gabriel. The L is added to the names of the angels to indicate that they are coming from God. So if we look at this specific angel, Michael, then what we have is Micah, which means mirror or likeness. And Michael took on the meaning, likeness of God, or he who is like unto God. Thus, El is the seed of all things, human and angelic. El is the seed of all things, human and angelic. And now we'll move on to Asherah and Kay. Kay, you can unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, are we ready?
Yes.
Okay. Already, I have a printout of what I was going to say, but the print is very light, so we're just going to run for it. Basically, Asherah was a major northwest Semitic mother goddess, appearing so in Akkadian sources as Ashratu. In Hittite, it's Asherdu, and in Ugaritic, it's Atarat. She was also the consort of El and the mother of 70 other gods. That number changes. Some of the texts have it as 80 gods. Some have 88, but she was very much the goddess of birth and fertility. In Judeo-Christian tradition, Asherah is considered a Canaanite false deity and a major source of temptation to the Israelites. In the book of Kings, the prophet Elijah challenged 400 prophets of Asherah. At the same time, he battled 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Other Bible references to Asherah refer to a type of sacred pillar or tree that was, excuse me, losing my voice with the allergies, erected next to Canaanite or Israelite altars in many places. These trees or groves were associated with sacred prostitution of the Canaanite fertility cult. On the other hand, there is suggestive archaeological evidence that Asherah may also have been regarded as the female consort to the Hebrew god Yahweh and was widely worshipped by Israelites within the context of Yahwism. Thus, she may have functioned as representing the divine feminine. As the Israelite prophets and religious leaders rightly struggled to purge Israel of the licentious rites of Canaanite paganism, in which Asherah played a central role, her healthier function as a carrier of the divine feminine became a casualty. Sometimes in the Ugaritic texts, sorry, I can't see this really well, sometimes called Athirat Yami, Athirat of the sea, the sacred sea or lake upon which the Ugaritic Asherah stood was known as Yam Kinneret, also now called the Sea of Galilee. In these texts, Asherah is the consort of the god El. One source refers to the 70 sons of Atarat, presumably the same as the 70 sons of El. She is not clearly distinguished from Astarte, better known in English as Astarte and Ashtart, however, is clearly linked to the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. Astarte/Ishtar differs from the Ugaritic in that the Ishtar shares more of Asherah's primary role as consort of the chief god and mother of major lesser deities and the goodness of the sea. Asherah's son, called Elat, the feminine form of El, or Kodesh, or holiness. So I'm not going to go through all the names of the various tribal groups because they are all called Asherah by a slightly different name. Ooh, I can barely read this, but let me go over to a piece, since she is a goddess of fertility, and they were very different than how we regard such things. And you've all heard of the sacred marriage that comes about in many, many cultures. This description is really interesting. I was talking to Alana about this. Let me see. For example, in the Gracious Gods text, there's a libretto of a sacred drama addressed to certain gracious and beautiful gods, described princes and high ones, and performed at the Canaanite spring festival of first fruits. There is an erotic scene between two girls who may be identified with Anat and Asherah, both of whom are characterized as at once the daughters and wives of El. The aged supreme god, having duly impressed his admirers by his ability in drawing and carrying water for cooking, I thought this was quite an interesting statement, and by his marksmanship in securing a bird for the pot, incidents which seem to be capable of interpretation in terms of sexual symbolism. He then kissed and seduced them, with the result that they conceived and bore two sons, Sharu, the dawn, and Shalma, the sunset. The birth was duly announced to El, and they were called gracious gods who suckle the breasts of Mistress Lady Queen Asherah. This could have been either an annual thing or 7 years apart, and the sacred marriage probably indicates a climax of a sacred dance and a ritual marriage between the priests of El and the temple priestesses in order to reproduce symbolically the birth of certain gods. The promotion of fertility, very likely to secure abundance of bread and wine when the gathering of first fruits was celebrated at the beginning of summer, or possibly the septennial observation at the end of every 7-year cycle. But whatever may have been the precise occasion of the ritual, there is every indication that the sacred marriage in its customary setting was an essential element in the underlying theme of the drama. Now, gods and goddesses kind of changed over time. Not quite as fast as the gods and goddesses that are being observed now, but gods and goddesses did a lot. There's a lot of competition. Who is going to maintain the greatest amount of deity and power? Okay, and just to complicate things, that in Hebrew the word Asherah is masculine, and biblical passages normally use Asherah to refer to the sacred image or pillar or tree that was often erected to altars belonging to El, Baal, and Yahweh. An Asherah of this type stood for many years in the Temple of Jerusalem itself, and sacred pillars were also erected in earlier times by the greatest Hebrew patriarchs and prophets, including Jacob at Bethel, Moses at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Joshua at Shechem. It was common practice at the time, and then was denounced later by other prophets, such as Ezekiel, with references such as, "Do not set up any wooden Asherah behind the altar, beside the altar you build." to the Lord your God. Do not erect a sacred stone, for these were the Lord your God hates. That's from Deuteronomy. Take your father's bull and second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal, which belongs to your father, and to cut the Asherah, which is beside it. For they are also built for themselves high places and sacred pillars, and Asherah on every high hill, and beneath every luxuriant tree. He broke in pieces the sacred altar pillars, cut down the Asherah, and filled their places with human bones. So the excuse me, I may have to drop out of this because I just cannot keep my voice going. She has lots and lots of names. She is the goddess of the sea, which sounds kind of weird because it's we think of this as being a desert, but it was very much close to the Mediterranean. And there are images. This one is a Phoenician mother goddess, probably Astarte. It's Alana may have it in the slides, but it's a goddess. She is seated. On each side of her, there are winged lions. She's holding a large vessel full of water, and that is what connects her to the sea, because especially in places like the Negev, you just can't do without water. So she's important in that way. Those are Asherahs. That one that just popped up, those are some of the Asherah little statues.
They mimic these mimic the posts that were put up, and the pose is always consistent. There may or may not be a face on the pillar, but there is always the very pronounced breasts and the hands cupping them.
And the same hairstyle over centuries.
And that same hairstyle maintains itself throughout the history.
Okay. So, in sexual symbolism, El's impotence is indicated. Therefore, it is not surprising that Anat, another version of Asherah, also became the wife of the virile younger god Baal, the rider of the clouds, their union being represented as that of a bull and a cow. Consequently, when Baal was said to love a heifer, this was merely a mythological expression of his union with Anat. Nevertheless, since she, with Asherah, is alleged to have sexual relations with El in his old age, it is not improbable she was originally his consort when he was head of the pantheon, before Baal became the dominant figure and the most potent force in nature. When the older god El became subservient to or was eclipsed by the younger divinity Baal, Anat assumed the status of Baal's wife and sister, while El was regarded as her father. So as you can see, they just, over time, the basic concept of the god and the goddess stayed the same, but the politics of Canaanite religion or the gods is fascinating and very, very much
A soap opera.
Yeah, it's a soap opera. Yeah, it's, you know, the bold and the beautiful or any of that stuff. It's just amazing. And it can drive you downright crazy too. The book I've been reading from is called The Cult of the Mother Goddess by E.O. James. And Ed and I had forgotten we had this book. Yeah. It's The Cult of the Mother Goddess, an archaeological and documentary study by E.O. James. He has plenty of backup on his credentials. He was a Doctor of Literature, PhD, Doctor of Divinity at St. Andrews, Professor Emeritus of the History of Religion in the University of London, Fellow of University College, and Fellow of King's College, London. So we found this. It was published in 1959 and has been reprinted in paperback. I don't know which company is doing it, but Ed found that out. You can remember.
I don't recall who the publisher is, but if you just look the title up online, you'll find it available. It is a very scholarly work, and Asherah is only a small section of the materials involved. Also, the conflation for gods or goddesses, Anat, Astarte, and Asherah, vary throughout the region. And I'm going to stick a parenthetical of sorts in here. We tend to think of, as modern Americans, things being very consistent. We're new at that. Before we had movable print and industrialization, the world was very happy to have everything in its own little separate box. Every town, every village, pretty much every family had its own view of the gods, their own take on it, special names for the gods, and everybody just lived with that. That's the way the world worked. Today, we pull our hair out trying to figure out what they're talking about. They were perfectly comfortable with this. In the 18th dynasty in Egypt, there are stelae and plaques showing a triune form of the Mediterranean mother goddesses. And it makes it very clear that they were still separating in the Amarna period Asherah, Astarte, and Alat. In Babylon, it is very obvious that Astarte eclipsed all the other names of the goddess, and her iconography took over. And that is pretty much where you start finding the lion imagery associated with this goddess.
Okay.
Back, kid.
Yeah, there's one last little section here that I thought was interesting, because we grew up in a Judeo-Christian society, and we think of there's God. God's a man. That's it. In Israel, ancient Israel, there's a section here by Israelite goddess worship. The veneration of Asherah, or Asherah poles, seems to have been fairly widespread in ancient Israel and Judah, and sometimes it was officially sanctioned. The Bible reports that during the days of King Josiah, 6th century BCE, the king tore down the quarters of the male prostitutes, sacred prostitutes, which were in the temple of the Lord and where women did weaving to Asherah. The Bible also is ripe with references to the Israelites committing sexual immorality with Canaanite deities at high places and sacred groves. Often this is a metaphor for Israel's faithlessness to Yahweh as her spouse, but in some cases the references are quite direct, and as such, they sacrifice on the mountains and burn offerings on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, where the shade is pleasant. Therefore, your daughters turn to prostitution, and your daughters-in-law to adultery. This has led many to include the worship of Asherah involved licentious rites. While this may result in part from the polemics of Israelite priests and prophets, it is also true that sacred prostitution was a well-established tradition in ancient Mesopotamia. The goddess Ishtar was particularly well known for this practice. But whether or not Ishtar worshipped involved sacred prostitution, it is clear that one or more female goddesses were widely worshipped in both Israel and Judah. Archaeological digs commonly uncover statuettes of a goddess not only in temples and public buildings, but in many private homes. In most cases, her exact identity is difficult to define. So that is basically what I have. There are many, many more pages, and we don't want to be sitting here for 3 hours. But
one more small follow-up. We have thus far dealt with her as a goddess. Over time, as with all pagan gods, when Christianity came along especially, she becomes, instead of Asherah and Astarte, what's the name now? The name is escaping me.
Ashtoreth.
She becomes Astaroth of the Lamagite. And in that is one of the great princes of, or excuse me, dukes of hell. This is strictly coming out of the Christian tradition, of course, that all of the big satanic entities have to be male. What you're seeing here in these later aspects in all of the various grimoire is that they have taken one more ancient goddess and converted it to a demon, just as the god Pan or Cernunnos in Northern Europe is turned into the horned Satan. Just one more aspect of things to bring in. Anything else, Kay?
I think I am done because I am going to go find a zinc lozenge right now. I'm sorry that my voice is so bad and I did not do this as well as I would have wished. But yes, I think I am done now.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for that.
I really liked your...
Well, hold on. We're recording right now.
Oh.
So let's hold the comments until the end.
Yeah.
I just want to draw your attention to this image over here, which is associated with Asherah. This is a tree of life, and it's associated with the poles that were discussed. Although I have no idea, I just saw this image. Kay also saw this image and sent it to me. And so it's associated with Asherah, but it's associated with the idea of the tree of life. So I would love to have learned more, but was unable to really find anything. And then look at this interesting thing above it. Just thought I'd point that out. These images. Okay, just want to show you a couple things real fast. Here's a burial inscription where it actually says in the inscription that Yahweh was married. Oh, I forgot to put it in, but it does say wife, and his wife Asherah. Of course, I left that word out. For from his enemies he has saved him. So this was on a grave. You can see the writings. If you look really close, you can see etchings. And this is a cult stand that was also thought to represent Yahweh and Asherah. Really interesting. You can see the animals in that. 4 tiers, very specific.
Like the cherubim and the elements.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, I didn't see that. You're right.
The lion, the man, the eagle.
Wow.
You got the different animals.
So yeah, see the overlap here in thought. And this is some things that were found. But the altar. So what they would find was they would find these setups with 2 different altars. And what they believed was that on one hand, hold on, I'm gonna sneeze, I'm sorry. On one hand, the altar seemed to be for El, and on the other side, the altar appeared to be for Asherah. And when they examined and tried to figure out what sorts of offerings were being burned for Asherah, what they found most commonly was cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to place some cannabis on my altar and add that to the collection of things that are on there to build the energy. So here's our references, and thank you very much. That's the end of our presentation.
Thank you.